and Iceland's social ones. Good. Now I put this paper, the paper we put on the archive, it immediately attracted some attention, especially, funny enough, from Belarus and, well, Ukraine, of course, and in Belarus. The sort of work I've been doing, or we've been doing for quite some time on mythology, has attracted quite a lot of attention in Belarus of all places. And I think around every September I seem to get lots of hits. I get more hits on my website, my personal website, from Belarus than I get from Ireland. So that's just the way. So people are interested in these sort of things. So so I want to send some message to people in these Belarus, Russia, obviously Ukraine, and everywhere, of course, as well. Right. So we've made some little rustle with our paper already before it's been published. I always feel a little bit that I have to explain why, as mathematicians or physicists, we're allowed to do mythology. So I'll start my talk with some of that, that we're even obliged, I would say, to talk about things that are political. Then I move on to an area called sociophysics. A friend of mine, I think it was Patrick, a PhD student, and my first PhD student in this general area invented the term mythomatics, which we're quite like. Network science, and then some applications to Ireland and Ukraine. Okay, so now, as I said, I start off with trying to establish my right to talk about anything to do with politics from a mathematical or statistical physics background. And this is, in a sense, nowadays quite important. Even in governmental terms here in the UK, there's a thing called impact, which is very important. That means we should. I like very much the idea of impact because, in some ways, because it obliges us academics to connect with people in the non-academic world. I mean, previously we were quite happy to live in the ivory towers and think about maths and highfalutin stuff. But now we have an obligation to communicate with people and people beyond the academic world. We've got a duty. And in the olden days, that was exactly what an academic should do. We have got an obligation, we are obliged to inform. And I would say a lot of the problems in the Slavic countries now is lack of information or misinformation, and information not properly communicated by academics as well. So nowadays, impact, the idea of impacting in the non-academic world is so important here in the UK that, and it's spreading, it will go elsewhere as well, that we don't even mention it. So I shouldn't really mention impact. It's so important I shouldn't have to mention it in my talk, because it should be endemic in everybody's research. And in the mathematical sciences especially, or at least not just especially, it's everywhere, but since we're here now in the Institute of Mathematics and its applications, where was the impact for the last research evaluation framework? For those who don't know about that, the REF, the research evaluation framework, that's an assessment of the research, the quality of research coming out of every mathematics department in the UK. It happens every 7 years. We're now waiting for the results of the current one, and the last one that we had before that was in 2014. There were altogether 210 impact case studies, as they're called, so 210 identifiable bodies of impact in all maths departments in our mathematical sciences department here in the UK. And of these, 151 were interdisciplinary. So interdisciplinary is the way, if you want to make impact, that's the way to go. A lot of them were societal. This talk is societal. A lot of them were political. Some of them were political. This talk is political. And some were cultural. This talk is cultural. So the bulk of my talk is really about impact rather than about the research itself that led to the impact. Although I also talk a little bit about the research itself. So I give you the framework for that as well. I mean, Martin said to me that the audience was quite mixed, and that there would be some, I think, sixth form students and some other people who were the more senior. So I try to mix it a little bit and try to explain to the more senior people why I'm talking about impactful stuff, and put a little bit of mathsy stuff in there as well for the younger people. So now, the point so far is that impact is important. We have a duty to communicate to beyond the ivory towers. We have a duty to inform as academics. That's what we're here for, traditionally and now. One way to do that, a very effective way, is through interdisciplinary research. And where are the other disciplines that we would like to work with? Well, here's a map. Here's our first network. It's a network of how the various disciplines are communicated to or linked to each other. These links are via citations, I guess. So you can see that I'm kind of pointing to this screen, but really I'm pointing to that screen, or maybe to this screen. But whichever way I point, the maths you can see on whichever screen we're looking at, is I can't really point anywhere because the people online, I guess, can't see me pointing, so it's daft if I point. Anyway, maths there is in purple and pink. It's closely connected to the computer sciences, a little bit further away the earth sciences, the chemistry and so on. But furthest away from them all is humanities and social sciences and humanities. So it can be, I mean, back, there was a certain time, around the 80s, let's say 90s, and even more recent times, where it was a little bit frowned upon, quite frowned upon even, to start messing around in other people's territory. And even it was frowned upon by mathematicians and by physicists that they would dare venture outside mathematics or physics. One of the first papers in this area was by a chap called Slavic. He's one of the founding fathers of SOCIOPHYSICS, as it's called. And his first paper in this area, he was in the physics department, and in those days he didn't have internet like we have now, so he had to physically write a paper and send it by post to a journal. But his head of department captured it and put it literally in a safe and did not allow him to submit the paper. So that was a serious violation of academic freedom. And eventually they battered down the barriers and liberated the paper and submitted it, and now it's a very famous paper, and the department has vanished into oblivion. But anyway, but actually more recently, a very good friend of mine in a very famous Russell Group university, and I won't identify the university in case I identify the person, but also said that we quite frown upon interdisciplinary, well, certainly on applied mathematics and interdisciplinary methods. So still a little bit of shift needs to take place, and we need to come away from the ivory towers. And even the IMA itself, and there's its vision statement that's about us, about the IMA, their opening lines say that they do maths and applications of mathematics. But even if you go back further to this is the point of view of mathematicians and physicists who dabble in other areas. They might not like it, but nowadays we're getting more to liking it. But also, if you encroach on somebody else's territory, they don't like it. So humanities people don't like it. They now do like it. Digital humanities has come about, for example, as a thing. Although we wouldn't say that we really do. We do something like that, but not quite that. John Keats lamented when physics itself was evolving. He lamented that physics and chemistry and these new sciences would unweave the rainbow. They didn't like this unraveling of the beauty of nature. But now, of course, we realize, when us physicists and mathematicians and scientists, that the more you understand nature, the more you are astonished by its beauty. And so there's nothing to be afraid of. We should seek to understand and learn. Back in the 20th century, there was Irving Babbitt. He said the humanities need to be defended today against the encroachment of the physical sciences, which is exactly what I'm doing to some extent. But we've evolved a little bit from that. Humanities aren't a science, stop treating them as one. That was actually the reaction of somebody, a science journalist, to our very first paper in mathematics, or applying mathematics to mythology. Initially we were a bit freaked out by that, but then I actually find it amusing now. And I like it, I'm glad she said it. Objections from people who are not scientists would say that, well, humans, what we want to do is look at networks of humans, and we're going to reduce the individual humans to mere numbers. People are worried that they say humans are not numbers. This is true, of course, but every time you vote in a referendum, you basically are a number. We can't take into account everybody's individual preferences. It all gets ironed out with the millions of people who vote for or against Brexit or something like this. The approach neglects details. That is absolutely true. We neglect details. But when Kepler was looking at the stars, he wasn't worried about the details of whether they have a river or a sea or a mountain or whatever was on it, or even an alien. He just cared about the dots and figured it out that way. That was enough. So we're quite used to doing that in physics. Physicists don't know what they're doing. That is, of course, true. I can't deny that. Albert Einstein said, well, if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't do it, really. We're lost until we do it, and even when we do it, I'd say we're sometimes bewildered with what we've done. So anyway, despite any objections that used to be, I'd say that we're brave enough now to enter into the interdisciplinary world and even into the world of humanities. And personally, I'm curious, but there's an allowance now with the emergence of the word complexity. So where the sum is different to the sum, where the total is different to the sum of its parts. So for example, water can form a wave, but an individual H2O atom does not exactly form a wave or something like that. So, and also it was the famous two cultures controversy back in the 50s, I think it was, the relationship between science and the humanities. There was a famous guy who had a foot in both camps, and he said that the big problem with society then, as now, of course, back in the 50s, nuclear war was on the horizon, and now we're back in the 50s. Society is split up into two polar groups who don't seem to be able to communicate with each other. Scientists on the one hand, and literary scholars or humanities people on the other. He said that the famous example he gave, if you speak to, I mean, everybody knows something about Shakespeare. I mean, even if you've not read Shakespeare, you know Shakespeare exists. But a lot of people who are not scientifically literate don't know what the second law of thermodynamics is. And he argued this is a problem, that especially politicians need to know a little bit about science and the value of the beauty of nature and humanity. Good. Anyway, that's my prelude. That sort of is my bashing the door down to talk about anything I like in the Institute of Mathematics and its Applications, my claim to academic freedom. So now we look at going from sociophysics, which other people have done, to mathematics or to the sort of stuff that we do with mythology. Now, actually, my background is statistical physics, and this is quite a lot closer to the humanities and social sciences than people might think at first sight. Back in the, in fact, it even comes from there. Back in the 18th century, people realized that there were predictable things. For example, you could predict the number of births that would happen in a country in a given year, any year, on the basis of what went before. People didn't like that. Scientists understood this, but people who were interested in statistics understood this. But other people didn't like this. They didn't like that you could predict what God is going to do. God is going to wipe out X amount of people next year. It's going to give so many people life by allowing them to be born. So there was a bit of resistance, but nowadays people understand statistics a little bit more. And sociology itself was originally called social physics. That's the guy who invented sociology, so to speak, Auguste Comte. He was the inspiration for the likes of Boltzmann. So really, people can classify sociophysics in a number of generations. Auguste Comte and his ilk were around 1700s, and I will speak a lot about the 1700s today when I get to the Irish part. The second generation of social physicists were the thermodynamicists. They, and people who wouldn't like the second law and so on, they tried to develop a thermodynamics for society. Basically, the upshot of that was everything is getting more, entropy is increasing, time is moving forward, everything's getting more chaotic, and we're all doomed. And then they moved on to the third generation, which was people like Dietrich Stauffer and Serge Gallon and people like that who do sociology. And indeed, many of the things we do now has been done before. Stephen Hawking said in the year 2000 that he thinks that this century, the one we're now in, it will be the century of complexity. And but that was already with Auguste Comte back in 1856. So many things we're doing now have been done before. Many ideas have been done before. We just do it differently. And we think we're discovering things for the first time. I want to give you a little bit of a background to my angle, my approach on these things, that my sort of DNA in a sense. Is from the point of view of statistical physics, and we're obsessed with phase transitions, things turning from one thing to another, like water into ice or things like this. Especially the example we usually use is that of magnetization. So here's a piece of iron which is magnetized. It turns out that iron is magnetized only up to a certain temperature, 770 degrees centigrade. Beyond that, it stays as a solid. It's not liquid yet, but it demagnetizes. And this is a lost hero of statistical physics. I really am very keen on this guy. I didn't know about him until only recently. Reinhard Falk pointed him out, who'd altered this history of physics, pointed him out. Richard Kirwan, he was from Ireland, and in the 1700s, and he had the idea that a magnet might be formed from things like atoms or whatever, magnetons as he called them. Magnetons, things which were, basically he said that a magnet would be demagnetized if atoms or magnetons were pointing randomly in all sorts of directions. And if they were aligned, then that would give a magnet. So the average would be pointing upwards or something like this. That was his idea, and he thought about that over there in the west of Ireland where that big red dot is, that I'm pointing to. Maybe I could hover with my mouse, maybe that's a way of pointing, yeah. So there it is. I'm from the middle there, a place called Athlone. It's on the Shannon River right through the middle of Ireland. And that's where Richard Kirwan, I must go and visit his grave or something. Anyway, but Richard Kirwan's idea didn't really work. He tried to calculate something, but he didn't get a phase transition. Then along came Wilhelm Lenz, and he had the idea to stick in interactions as well. And so putting interactions into, not just, you don't just have magnetons doing their thing, but you have them also interacting with each other. So it's like society. In society we interact. I mean, Margaret Thatcher believed there was no such thing as society, just the individual. So she was believing in everybody as an individual and doing their own thing, and greed is good mentality. But then actual society, as we know, we know certainly from COVID, we've got to interact or else we all go crazy. And that may be part of the reason why we're in the bad situation we're in now in Ukraine. People being too isolated and going crazy. Anyway, Lenz gave the idea to his student Ernst Ising, and the first citation in Ising's thesis was actually for the Irish guy I mentioned, Richard Kirwan. Ising heroically solved the problem. Mathematically, it was an excellent thing to do, but it didn't produce a magnet. So it was only one dimension. It was one dimension he did. It was a success mathematically, but it did not produce a phase transition, so people kind of dismissed it. Kind of a bit mean to dismiss this heroic piece of work. So now we've got two failures already, Richard Kirwan, and we've got Ising as well, who did good things, but didn't work. And then during the Second World War, Lars Onsager from Norway, he did solve it in 2 dimensions and showed it does produce a phase transition. And basically everything that we do now is centered around the Ising model. And that's a 2 dimensions phase transition. In 3 dimensions, actually in 1 dimension, we did Petros Sakalic, a PhD student who was co-chair between us in Coventry and our friends in Lviv in Ukraine. And Petro did a very, very nice PhD where he did rescue phase transitions in 1 dimension by putting in what are called ghost states. Ghost states are ones which have negative entropy. So you put in states, they have by putting in extra states that have no energy, they already introduce more stuff, more information into the system. It gives more entropy, but then mathematically we can do whatever we want. And he puts in a negative number of these things, and we get a nice phase transition in 1D. 3D remains unsolved. People think you can't solve it. So rather than, I mean, some people do heroically or crazily try to solve it, the 3D Ising model. I mean, it's a Herculean task. And some people try it, but most people try to do something else. So, for example, applying this model to other areas, such as, for example, to bankers. Bankers definitely do interact with each other, because if one banker sells stocks or shares or whatever they do, if one does it, then the other one does it. The one nearby does it. And they all start copying each other and behaving like magnets. So you get phase transitions of bankers. Also, even trees. I was amazed by this paper that came out recently. People did an experiment on trees and found that the correlation in the yield in the crop of trees follows an Ising model type pattern. So the trees are actually interacting with each other. And no, it's not some weird hippie stuff. They interact through the fungus underground. If one gets a disease, the next one gets a disease. The brain. There's models that the people. Well, if we can crack this one, then we know a lot. Anyway, let me go back to Richard Kirwan. So now you can see that Richard Kirwan is quite heroic. He was the one who started this thing about randomness, this idea of randomness. He missed out on the interactions, but that was understandable. And the first citation of his work was, the first citation of Ising's thesis, on which we all rely now, was to Richard Kirwan. But since then he's dropped into oblivion, people have forgotten him, and they don't cite him, and he's kind of lost. But there he is in Ising's thesis, being cited as the first citation of Ising's thesis. This is where he's from, as I say, in the west of Ireland. A little bit about him. The time period we're talking about is the 1700s to the 1800s. Then he had to conform. He was Catholic brought up, but he had to conform to the established religion. That's basically the Church of Ireland. If he didn't do that, there was no chance of him becoming a physicist or a mathematician or anything. He was doomed. So he did that. He actually was quite successful then. He lived 19 years in London, became a fellow of the Royal Society, and was a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and became very high up in Dublin and so on. But secretly, he was a member of the United Irishmen. That was a rebellious organisation back in the 1790s, and these were advocating for Catholic emancipation and overthrow of British rule in Ireland. He was actually, because he was good at what he did in physics and maths and so on, he was offered a peerage, so to become Sir Richard Kirwan, but he declined it. He was offered it by Lord Castlereagh. Lord Castlereagh was notorious. There's a poem from Shelley about the Peterloo massacre in Manchester, where troops rode roughshod over 60,000 citizens and killed 15 of them. You can see the poem there. I met murder on the way. He had a face, he had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked, yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. So you can imagine Castlereagh wasn't exactly a nice guy, and Kirwan declined the peerage on that basis. Kirwan actually started off as a physicist, but he ended up doing comparative mythology of all things. So even the very first statistical physicist did comparative mythology, which is, so even when we started doing our comparative mythology in 2010 or 2010 or 2012, we were not the first, far from it. We were 250 years late to be the first. Anyway, so off we go now. So now we see that from statistical physics, we like to look at atoms. Atoms do something collectively, and they generate like a magnetic piece of iron or something. People in a crowd, people interact with each other, and that creates a society. Our thing is to look at networks in narratives, in epic narratives, in mythological narratives. So to do that, I just had to give very, very, very brief introduction to some of the basic concepts of network science. It came on the scene in the last century, actually, the end of the last century, where these guys, Watson, Strogatz, and they looked at the networks in the brain of a worm, in a power grid network, and in collaborations of movie actors, and they found that these networks were nothing like a lattice, as you'd expect. They were also not random, but there was something else in between, and that was some sort of complex network, and there were similarities between them. And they developed, or people developed, things we can measure. So, for example, you can measure the characteristic path length of a network. How connected are we? How far away is any individual, like me, for example, from away to any other individual? So, for example, from me to Putin, how many steps would it take? And now I know it would take 3. So I know a physicist in Moscow who knows another physicist who knows Putin. So I'm 3 steps away from Putin. And and then we can have the idea of, well, that's characteristic path length. So you take the average of everybody, you get some sort of an idea of what happens in the overall network of the world, and we're very connected. Structural balance is another one. So you know that it's very hard to maintain friendships with 2 people who are enemies of each other. This is the idea. You tend to, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend is the idea of this. Structural balance. So you can, if you have a network in which you have positive interactions and negative interactions, then you typically, if it's a social network, you've got structural balance. Other networks might not have. So, for example, I did disconnect my friendship with the guy in Moscow. Well, there's a reason for that, and the war was part of it. And so I now have a negative link to that guy in Moscow. He's got a positive link and a positive link. So that's why I have a negative link, because he's got a positive link. And anyway, I don't mention names there either. But that's structural balance. Then clustering coefficient is another thing. We can measure the extent to which a network is clustered. And here, for example, we've got a network of four characters or four something. And you've got 1 triangle filled up. It could be that C and A are linked to each other, and D and A are linked to each other as well. Then it would be even more clustered. So we've all these measures. We've also got the idea of degree distribution. Very few people have very many friends. And like, for example, the movie actors I mentioned earlier, the movie actors can be very famous and they can have lots of fans or kind of friends. But mostly people have a limited number of friends. But now we've more with Facebook and stuff. But there is a distribution of that, and we can look at this. So the number of connections you have is your degree. Assortativity is a good one. Is one of these used a lot. Birds of a feather flock together. Basically, it means you tend to hang out with people who are similar to yourself. So, for example, movie actors. If you ever wondered, movie actors tend not to just marry random people. They tend to marry other movie actors, often you find. And so people tend to gravitate. The physicists tend to gravitate together, and people are quite assortative, or they like people who are like themselves. So you can measure this. Assortativity is the tendency to hang out with people who are like you, and disassortativity is the opposite. Now our aim, so that's the theory part of it. Our aim is to export these concepts from physics to socio stuff to narratives. So that picture there is one of the very famous front cover of an Irish narrative called Tónbó There we started this in 2010, and we got a grant from Leverhulme that brought Padraig McCarran over from Ireland, and Padraig is now back in Ireland, and I'm working as a postdoc over there in Limerick. And that was our first paper. That paper actually, I'm amazed, it generated over 30,000 downloads to this day. That's the most downloaded paper in the history of any physics journal in Europe. And it was all about mythology in a physics journal. So it's so you can see, but so when these guys in Belarus and so on are clicking on our website, they're clicking on that paper and downloading it and so on. So mythology is a way to communicate with people. People are interested in mythology. I think more people are interested in mythology, and I find it accessible than mathematics. The 3 things we looked at originally in our original paper was on Tombo Cunha in Ireland, that's the cattle raid of Cooley. That was a war between Connacht in the west of Ireland and Ulster in the north of Ireland, and lots of heroism going on there. Beowulf in England, which people will be familiar with in England. The Iliad in Greece. So we wanted to put the Irish Tombo Cunha on the same stage as the more famous Beowulf and the Iliad. I think there's lots of movies about the Iliad, and Beowulf has a movie, but poor Tombo Cunha hasn't, I don't think. Not yet. So now I want to get to the main point. Two stories I want to tell you, two bits left in my presentation. Firstly, I want to tell you a little bit about the epic poems of Ossian. So after we did our first work, which had all them downloads, we then moved on to more other types of things. And one of the things we moved on to was the epic poems of Ossian. And this brings us back to the time of Richard Kirwan again, the Irish guy, back to the 1760s. And the story there is this. So the background is that back in 1746, there was the Battle of Culloden, which was the final showdown between the Scottish and the English. And the Scottish lost. That was the end of Scottish independence then, anyway. And so, of course, that's we discuss now a lot these days again. So obviously, after that, the Scottish were quite depressed and so on, and things were pretty bad for them. But then in 1760, down from the mountain came a guy called James Macpherson, very surprisingly, down from the highlands of Scotland. And he came down with what he called fragments, a translation into English of fragments of ancient poetry, collected from the highlands of Scotland and translated by himself from the Gaelic, as they call it, or Erse language. That's similar to the Irish language or the Gaelic language, that language. And there was a certain type of, the prose and the poetry and so on, the way of communicating was different to anything that had been done before. Rhythmic prose and sparse diction, created I never know how to pronounce this word, ethereal, I think. It's kind of nebulous, kind of vague, kind of spooky atmosphere, romantic atmosphere, which captured the interest of a receptive public. Then he went back up the mountain and brought down an epic, so not just fragments, but a whole epic, and another one. And so the reception was enormously positive. People who are, these names you will recognize in literature, Blake, Byron, Coleridge, Goethe, Shevchenko in Ukraine, and people, this to your right there is the statue of Shevchenko in Lviv. And the people there are my friends who are in Lviv right now, and some of them are at this talk. And there's myself, sort of poking my head in there. But anyway, so Shevchenko, the point is that this statue of Shevchenko he was a pretty important guy, and there's the statue. And music, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Schubert, and art, all these guys, and Thomas Jefferson in America, he said that Ossian was the greatest poet that ever existed. So clearly this guy made a big splash, Macpherson and all these things. And one of the great things that was achieved, that it prompted other people to look at their own ancient literature. Previous to this point, people didn't really value their own literature, their own culture. If anything was if they found an old book, for example, they would say, well, here's an old book, let's burn it for the fire. They didn't really know the value of these things. Comparisons of Macpherson's work with the classics was immediate. Ossian, I should clarify, Ossian was supposed to be a bard from the 3rd century, that his work had been communicated in Scotland down through generations and eventually put to writing by Macpherson. Blair was Macpherson's friend who compared immediately this work to the classics. So Ossian became known as, they tried to promote him as Homer of the North. By the way, this is a statue now in Ukraine. So you've seen in the newspapers the statues being covered up and trying to protect them from Russian bombardment and so on. So these statues are extremely important. They're very important to all of us. Our statues, the big controversy recently about in the Black Lives Matter and all that stuff, and the statues here in Britain, that tells us what these things mean to us as for social cohesion, identity of ourselves locally or nationally or internationally. Samuel Johnson, you'll know him, he's the guy who invented the dictionary. He was not at all happy with this stuff coming from Scotland. He said he did not believe you could possibly pass these narratives down generation to generation verbally, orally, throughout the years without having it written down. And so he said he thought this was deceitful, there was something wrong there. But he viewed Gaelic or Gaelic or Irish or Scottish or anything like that as the rude speech of a barbarous people. So he didn't really, back in those days, in the imperial area, the British scholars and administrators, they really aligned themselves towards the classics. They saw themselves as the torch of civilization came from the Greeks to the Romans and the anti-British and the other empires, but the Scottish and the Irish were basically savage and they were inferior. So colonization was justified because they were bringing a superior culture to these countries. So, so the conflict was Scotland versus England then, romanticism versus classicism, nationalism versus imperialism, and this was a major, the biggest controversy in literature ever was the Oceanic controversy. But the reaction in Ireland was absolutely, completely outraged, because people in Ireland immediately recognised the characters and the places and so on in these Oceanic works as being sort of pinched from Irish mythology and Irish stories. So, for example, Ossian, who had one role in this Macpherson thing, had another role. Everybody in Ireland knows who Ossian is. We all learned it at school and have done for centuries. Fingal was Ossian's father in the Macpherson's work, and Finn McCool is the leader of the Fianna in Ireland. Cú Cullen, I think I mentioned him before, he appeared but in a different role. So people were there in the stories, but they were all weird and in the wrong place and doing the wrong things. And so the Ireland was really outraged that basically Macpherson had considered that they had misappropriated Irish mythology, which is basically identity, and took it for their own. So the question now is Ossian, this Oceanic works, is this Homer of the North? Is it like the classics, or is it more like the Irish stuff? And that's what we investigated from a network point of view. And well, this slide will tell you nothing, just to say that we measured lots of things and we did a lot of work. That's what it means. And this slide really gives us the conclusion. This is the degree distribution, and you can see, well, Ossian is in red in both plots there, and the Irish one is in green on the left, and the classics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, is over there on the right, which is in blue. And you can see that Ossian, well, we didn't have to do any statistics, but we did some statistics on this. You see that Ossian is much more like the Irish text than the classics. So what does it mean? Well, it means it's for us, this was interesting to do. We just did it. Actually, we're, again, 250 years too late, because everybody knew that Ossian was from the Irish stuff. So we weren't really doing anything new. But it was interesting to see that the networks give us something. What you can conclude from that is your own business in a sense. But we liked it, we enjoyed it, we made it, we did it, because we liked mythology, we liked stories, we analysed the stories, and we just had fun and did it. And well, now we're investigating how, now this is obviously not, Macpherson did not have to hand a network of all the characters of Irish mythology and evilly move them all around. He didn't have that to hand, but we imagine if he did, then how could he have done it? That's our current work that we're doing. Okay, that was back in the 1760s. So why should we care? Well, for us originally, this was just a nice thing to do, and we had a little bit of impact in the media, but not a huge amount. Actually, funny enough, not a lot in Ireland. Actually, we were pretty much ignored in Ireland. And again, probably big hit in Belarus again, but nobody cared in Ireland. And I think we might have made one minor article in the Irish Times, which wasn't even in print, it was just online. And so anyway, but then it became important in about 2019, I think it was. So let me go back to Athlone, my hometown. So this is my hometown there, just that big red dot there on top. And the Shannon River is the river that flows through it, and there it is on a bright sunny day. And once, about 3 years ago or so, when I was in Athlone, I didn't know this, but then I found that the town had selected, they wanted to build a monument to the town, of the town's identity. And the monument should like this thing that they had in Lviv, I just showed you. But they wanted to have that this monument, the statue, should represent the town, its position in the River Shannon, and its connection to the rest of the world, sort of thing. So they had, in some mysterious process, three statues were created, or not actually full statues, but were proposed, and these were the three. And they asked the people of the town to vote. And the people, they didn't tell the people anything. They didn't say anything about what these represent, and except for something to do with the river. And people say, okay, well, that looks kind of like Neptune, and it's something to do with the sea, and the sea is something to do with the river. So most people voted for that one, and that was selected. And that's how big it is. And they said that, but they did say that it harks back to Irish mythology. But no information was given about Irish mythology or anything. And people are not educated in Irish mythology, except for very, very, very little kind of it. So I was very annoyed because this was this is exactly the same thing as happened with Ossian 250 years previously, and so I went. I created a little bit of a fuss and went on the newspaper, and but I was outraged because of the history around this. Not just the that it comes from Ossian, but what it means. I mean, here it is. This is Dublin now, in Dublin, and in Dublin there's a place called the Custom House, which is where back in the olden days they took basically the wealth of the rivers of Ireland and exported them to the British Empire, and there they taxed them in the Custom House. And because they took the wealth, they got the wealth from the rivers, they put up monuments to Ossianic type, classical, neoclassical statues on the Custom House. They're still there, representing the rivers of Ireland. So any mythology or identity that existed before, they didn't care about all that. That was rubbish. Gaelic, Gaelic, Irish, Scottish, anything like that, they just invented their own, which has no story to them. And the people who did this were John Beresford is the guy who he was the first tax collector in Ireland. There's the architect James Gandon. Their world, these are not my words, these are historians' words. The world of privileged nobility. Beneath them was the impoverished underclass struggling for their basic civil rights. And when they protested, Beresford said they should be kept down by a policy of unyielding repression. These were his words. And when people protested, they were the troops, let's say, were said, well, laugh at the folly of the people. That was the attitude back then. Just a little bit of history of Ireland since that period. In 1801 was the Act of Union where the Empire included Ireland. Up to the 1800s, the penal laws, you weren't allowed to speak Irish, read Irish, play Irish music, study law or medicine if you were Catholic anyway. And 1840s came what we call the Gorta Mór, which means the Great Hunger. We don't call it famine because it wasn't really famine. There was plenty of food in the country, and but it was exported exactly through the same route as that statue was sitting. And death, millions died, millions more emigrated, mostly to the USA, but also here to the UK, many. And then 1921 came the semi-independence of Ireland with partition. So that's a statue there, a famous one in Dublin, to your right, to the right, the top right, of people in famine. Well, we don't call it famine. Upwards more, Gorta Mór in Ireland back then. Compare Ukraine, since I'm going to talk about Ukraine shortly. Up to World War I, was part of the Russian Empire. 19th century, they were forbidden to use the Ukrainian language in print, to import Ukrainian publications, to stage plays or lectures in Ukrainian. In the 1930s, during the Stalin times, Holodomor, our Upwards Mór, they don't call it famine either because it wasn't a famine, it was Holodomor. There was purposeful starvation and death, emigration to Canada. You can see the histories are very, very similar. 2014 invasion of Donetsk, Crimea, and so on and so forth. And on a scale which is bigger, 10 times bigger than Ireland. If you go back to the original Irish mythology, the River Shannon does have a deity. Her name is Shannon. That's hence the name Shannon of the river. She's has a personality. She's radiant, ever generous, strong, gentle lady of noble repute, sweet-voiced, red-lipped maiden, fair in form. She has a personality. Her mission was to seek wisdom, and there's actually I meant to upgrade this slide. We've got the story archaeologists are people that we now work interdisciplinarily, and people tell us. So, for example, as a result of one of the things I'm very, very, very happy about is as a result. I mean, initially when I started looking at this, I had to look at the translations of the story of Shannon, and but these translations were made by people back in the 1900s. They were translated from Irish to English, but carelessly and not correctly, and the subtleties were lost. And if you look for Shannon now on Wikipedia, you'll see the wrong story. But because of our work highlighting this goddess, now we have the right story and translated it, but it's actually not published academically yet, but we tried to work on that. And she wasn't some timid woman. She was a strong, defiant woman looking, demanding knowledge, her rights. Then this is so basically on the one hand you've got Macpherson's work, you've got a colonial creation of something that looks like the classics. On the other hand, you have something indigenous, original, and rich, and should be valued. There's my little girl at home in Rugby, where I live, reading The Children of Blur, which is the stories of Irish mythology, trying to endow with some connection with our culture. As I say, I was very annoyed. So I called for a rethink on this sculpture before the sculpture was erected, and people then did get informed, and they were furious when they were informed. When they were informed that they were misinformed, they were really angry. And they made all sorts of, they went on TV, they formed a petition, they protested. There they are sitting with their maths, that's people sitting with maths and myths books to show that this protest started from maths and myths. And by the way, I should say that the humanities people did not intervene to say that this was wrong. So it took this our weird interdisciplinary stuff to start this. Then the whole thing with national people, like, how well do you know our statues, was in some of the national newspapers in Ireland at one point. National focus on statue row. So there was quite a. This is the TV. In the end, they laughed at the folly of the people, and they put up the statue anyway. So it's there now to this day, and there it is. It's a monster in a rainy day, and there. But we do inform, and we worked in collaboration with the Irish Post newspaper to have an arts competition in celebration of that particular river goddess. And in the next 2 months, we're going to announce another one. We have £10,000 up for grabs for prizes of other women, especially, who are overwritten in Irish what do you call it? Iconography. So not just this one particular river, but other as well. Now that we come down to the last leg of the journey to Bolivia, and this is the paper that I alluded to at the very beginning of my talk, where I said that we have a paper that we are trying to get out there before it's even published, so we put it on the archive and so on. These are the authors, and some of the same gang. Our gang is getting bigger, and Nazar Federak there is our humanities expert to guide us along our journey, and Katjo Sarkanic is the chap who I mentioned earlier, who solved the Ising model in one dimension with the negative entropy states. Actually, we did start that paper. We did have a paper a number of years ago in Ukrainian on the same topic. But again, it was pretty. It was interesting academically for a little while, but now it becomes more important. And like the Irish one, it was interesting as a curiosity. And then that statue was starting to go up, so it suddenly became really impactful. We didn't know this was going. The statue was coming. We didn't know this war was going to break out. But we were working on these things before anything that happened. So we consider epics from the heyday of the Kievan Rus, from the end of the 9th to the mid 11th centuries. What they are is they're short, melodious, epic songs of Eastern Slavs. There's 2 cycles of them. There's the heroic epic and the social legendary parts. The heroic ones are the ones which are centered around Kyiv and in modern-day Ukraine. That's not more, God, it's modern-day Ukraine. There's other ones which are centered around Moscow and Novograd, and these were created later, the more social epics. And they are centered around the ordinary people like merchants and musicians and so on. And these were also passed from person to person throughout the years. A lot of them were collected in the northern eastern Slavic lands, and a lot of them were written down in Ukraine. So they overlap in characters, and the main character in these stories is a chap called Prince Vladimir, who basically performs the function of the king. There are characters like battle heroes, good guys, bad guys, all sorts of fascinating story. Another interesting character is Ilya, who's an old, experienced warrior who does not always blindly obey. So he has that defiance as well, the same as Shannon has, and he doesn't always perform the orders of Prince Vladimir, the boss. And he sometimes transforms into something else, or sometimes even resists them. And of course, these stories feature the usual hyperbole, the exaggerations that are typical to heroic narratives, just like in Cú Chulainn and the Ulster cycle. They have superpowers. They can do all sorts of things. So they exaggerate just as we exaggerate. Actually, some people believe, it's a little bit controversial, but some researchers believe that Prince Vladimir is actually a kind of a conglomeration of 3 characters, all whose names are Vladimir as well. And these are real historical people. So one is the Baptist of the Kievan Rus. These were actually, this is alluded to in Putin's essay, by the way. Not that they're this detail. He distorts it. Anyway, there's 3 different Vladimirs who are arranged with each other, who somehow possibly become all one in these epic narratives. And again, these so some people believe that the Prince Vladimir is actually a collection of these characters, and these are the three: the Ukrainian prince writer, another Vladimir whose characteristics are justice, zeal, enlightenment, wisdom, and charity, not too dissimilar to Shannon in Ireland. Another one is a philosopher, never seen in the land of Rus, who took care of his people as a father, the embodiment of wisdom, humility. This is the Ukrainian coin, by the way, and there's Vladimir. So as I say, these things are very important symbols of national identity and cohesion of people. And this is the network that we built. There's Prince Vladimir, and this is he's got loads of people around him. He's not just sitting there in lonely isolation. Again, we did a lot of work, so you won't glean much from this, but what it does say, I just want to show you that we compare to lots of other narratives from around Europe. Sorry, I'm pointing up there, but it's Millennia we're comparing to Beowulf, to the Tombo Culia in Ireland, to the Iliad, to the Odyssey, to the Icelandic sagas, and so on. And we find that they have all similar properties to these other narratives. They have unifying characteristics and distinguishing ones. We detect actually that these Ukrainian millennia, they're very like Ireland's heroic cycle, the Tombo Culia, very, very similar to that. And if we take the character who's the chief character and we randomly spin into three characters, then it turns into much more like a social epic rather than a heroic epic in terms of networks. And it turns more into something like the Icelandic sagas. So we can say that somewhere the Kyiv cycle, we didn't look at the Moscow cycle, the other cycle, we didn't look at that yet. We will look at it in due course, we simply didn't get around to it. But the Kyiv cycle is the cycle that we did look at, and this is what we found, that it falls neatly between something like the different European traditions like the Icelandic or the Irish in terms of heroism or socialism. I'm nearly there now. Now, at the end of our paper, I'd just like to communicate this to you and to anybody we can. At the end of our paper, because of the bizarre, the circumstances of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's almost on the basis of Putin's essay and Putin's thinking. It would be, to put that in Irish terms and British terms, it would be like Boris Johnson invading Ireland on the basis of Ossian being something to do with Irish stuff. It's just incredibly bizarre and so mad. And in his essay, well, you can see here, in our special note, we have at the end of our paper there's a special note which is political, obviously. National epics like the ones discussed in this paper, our paper, are important elements of national identity. Many countries use representations of iconic characters from the mythological or historical past in identity documents, iconography, and coinage, as we've seen. In his recent essay, which, as I gave you before the title, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, Vladimir Putin invokes this distant past when he says the spiritual choice made by Saint Vladimir, who was both Prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kyiv, still largely determines our fate today. This is the basis for his invasion, this type of stuff, that they were once, they have some commonality, therefore there should be all as one part of one empire. This is his view, and this is his view, that the idea of the Ukrainian people as a national separate from the Russians has no historical basis. That's the same as saying that Ireland has no right to exist, on the basis that Ireland was once unwillingly part of the British Empire. And any disputes we have between the two countries now are resolved in negotiation and through the mechanism I said before. We have a referendum, and we can wait. If we want unity, for those who want unity can wait. For those who don't want can argue against in a civilized way. But so this way is bringing us right back. To invade on the basis of this is bringing us right back to how many 100 years ago. And but after that essay by Putin, so this action of Russia in Ukraine now is like something that would have happened 100 years ago now. So Putin considers himself, a famous historian, Timothy Snyder, said of Putin after that essay, he said, Putin considers himself the second Vladimir the Great, this character from the and he sees this task as completing his work, which began more than 1,000 years ago. And there's Vladimir the Great on the left, there he is surrounded by lots and lots of people, and there's the person who's not surrounded by lots and lots of people, but is stuck there in isolation with maybe a few sycophants saying yes or no, sir. And Vladimir the Great, remember, there was Ilya, who does not always blindly perform the orders of Vladimir, but is defiant and resists them. And corrects him when he does the wrong thing. And I end the talk with the IMA statement on Ukraine. This is the Institute of Mathematics and its Applications, if you haven't read it. So they support the UK and international actions against the Russian state attack on Ukraine, which is a violation of international law, regards the Russian invasion as an attack on the fundamental values of freedom, democracy and self-determination, which in turn provide the basis of academic freedom and opportunities of academic cooperation. Hence my disconnect from the academic guy that I mentioned earlier in Moscow. That ceases. And I was actually an advisor to a Russian university in Moscow, and I withdrew from that. That university, HSE Moscow, they put out a statement in favor, as many Russian universities have done, in favor of the war. So I quit. We are in as with the IMA, we are in strong solidarity with the people of Ukraine and our mathematical colleagues. Then they go on to say, of course, at the same time, there is also Russian academics and scholars who are themselves horrified at Russia's invasion. And I would say that these people have I mean, it's hard to speak out when you're oppressed, but we do have a duty. Inaction is action. By not speaking out, it is a problem. Anyway, on this sad note we end, and this worrying note we end the talk, and I thank you very much for listening to me. So I don't know what we can do, but except send money to Ukraine, because that's what they need, and welcome the refugees. I should say that Ireland is very, very good in the refugees. I think we've got 20,000 or something like that have come to Ireland, or are coming to Ireland. UK is a little bit slower off the mark. We'd appreciate a bit of acceleration there, Boris. Okay, thank you anyway, thanks. Questions?
So a lot of what you've said is really about communication. It's about communicating accurately and communication. And the heroes you've identified have been very good at that communication, haven't they? They've been very much part of their societies. So how important do you think it is? I mean, we're thinking about, in your talk about languages, but you're beginning about other disciplines. There are signature pedagogies in all of them, and there are languages to learn. Do you think that these languages are a significant barrier? Do you think our systems build in enough time to learn new languages and to do this stuff? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a very, I like that question very much, and it's very, very relevant. I mean, at this stage, when we started out on this, it was challenging to communicate our way of thinking. We have a way of thinking as mathematicians, physicists, statistical physicists. We've got a way of thinking which people who are not thinking in our way don't get it. I remember one time, one of the first, actually it was in Russia. There was I gave a talk in St. Petersburg, and about our work. And when I was talking about Beowulf, and one thing that we did with Beowulf, the story is we've removed Beowulf, the character, from the network to see what it was like without Beowulf. So we, as Petro earlier there, he was able to, in the Ising model in one dimension, he was able to put in, we do in physics, we put in extra states that were doing nothing, sort of, they were just adding entropy. Then he put a negative number of these entropic states, entropic sites into the thing. So he was able to suck entropy out of it to see if the one-dimensional model could eventually give a phase transition, which it did. So we're used to thinking like that. We create alternate realities to see what reality is like. And so too, we can create alternate mythologies to see what the mythology is like. So we removed Beowulf from Beowulf the character from Beowulf the story to see the effect of that. And poor lad, a very senior person who spent all his life studying Beowulf in St. Petersburg, he was horrified. He could not get his head around the idea that we would remove Beowulf from Beowulf. And he protested strongly, saying that removing Beowulf from Beowulf is not Beowulf. And I tried, on the podium it was hard to anyway, we eventually went for coffee. And after an hour, he was convinced. I don't know whether he said he was convinced or he was convinced, but I tried to convince him that yes, exactly. We have ways of communicating, and it's hard to get the message across in a few words. Yeah, we had to sit down with him for an hour, and there were other instances like that. And eventually, people did come around, and now people like what we do, and we have people. They trust us now. They didn't trust us in the beginning, but now they trust us. And that was it, so trust.
But I think it's the same in the opposite direction as well, because we have this sort of very rigid, well not rigid, we have a very particular way of thinking, and it's about proof, and it's very easy, particularly in the pure end of things, to get very proud. We are the only subject that has actual proof and not simply arguments from the latest data kind of thing, to think that we are the pinnacle and to look down on everyone else, and that is a complete barrier.
Yes.
Because when we go into somebody else's domain, we have to learn their language. We have to be humble. There's a certain humility required for this, and it's not built into mathematical pedagogy generally.
Absolutely, totally agree. And that's the thing. I mean, I remember it's funny. At one point in Coventry, I kind of assembled a gang, and 15 of us, like, I didn't do this purposefully, didn't order them to sit there. It just as there was a few of us chatting, and then more gathered, and we were talking about the value of interdisciplinary, and you could tell the ones who would be against it, and the ones who were for it. But there were people against it, actually against it. But that this mathematicians should do mathematics, physicists should do physics, and we should be all up picking the high-hanging fruit of whatever it is in highfalutin stuff. And this sort of stuff, I mean, for example, the stuff I showed you there, the mathematics that we use there is very easy. But we are, it doesn't need to be hard. Why make it hard if it doesn't have to be hard? The novelty here is the application of mathematical ideas, concepts and stuff to these areas. But yes, you're right, we have to, I mean, so I felt in Coventry, I don't think people are respecting some of this stuff that I'm doing because it's easy. It's too easy mathematically. And it's hard humanities-ly, but it's not hard mathematically. And so it's very hard to have your foot in both. You have to do the hard math stuff and the interdisciplinary stuff to keep respect. That's a thing.
And I think this is where one of the dangers is for early career mathematicians. Because you would have had a strong history in your statistical business before you went into that. So in some senses you were safe because you could play in both playgrounds. But if you go into this too early, so do you think there are structures or things that we can do to make this less of a problem? Because we only get sort of the seasoned people into the interdisciplinary. We're not going to get the fresh ideas of the younger people, are we?
Yes, but I think the impact agenda is our liberation on this. I think if we play it right, I think my fear for the impact agenda is that it's overly governed. But you know my paper on 2 conscious on that. I fear that the worry is that because academics think that they should just be doing academic stuff, just be doing mathematicians should just be doing mathematics. They need to take it on themselves to do impact, not just do impact, but assess impact, and not leave it to professional services who some are of course great people, but many are not trained, and they don't really. You give them they take everything not holistically, but in a very weird, metrics-driven, rather simplistic way of looking at things. So I think it's our responsibility as academics to embrace and own impact, and don't give it away to metrics. There's danger of that, I think.
Ralph, I have a question, which is, and this is related to the later part of the talk. Now, just taking the 2 different pictures, Prince Vladimir and Putin, for example, one is surrounded by a lot of other people, the other is not. Now, if we just turn it around, can we say that somebody in a position of potential dictatorship, who has a lot of interactions going on about exchanging opinions, like opinion dynamics, would that amount to sort of dissolution in the rigid state of beings?
Dissolution of the
person, I mean, would that sort of amount to a bit of a dilution in the dictatorship position?
That's what I'm thinking. Like that you mean that the person is influenced by surrounding themselves by people who have opinions. Is this what you mean? That if you yes, exactly, yes. Which is basically democracy. And if everybody has a right to their own opinion and to be heard in some way. I think that this is, well, I mean, there's a whole body of work out by Robin Dunbar about this type of stuff, and I like very much where, yes.
Well, just, sorry,
No, go ahead.
I mean, you know, one point that bugs me a little bit about this approach is, not your approach, I mean the argument there. You see, I mean, when you think of sort of and implemented stable version of democracy, you will think of some thresholds of interaction below and above which things happen or not. But these thresholds are very often artificial influence. It's like a poverty line, for example. A poverty line defined independent of the data. How do you incorporate such a self-consistent threshold in the mechanism unless you don't have any?
Yeah, that's such a question. I mean, because of course we know these can be manipulated as well, as was done, for example, Cambridge Analytica and these guys who we are constantly being manipulated. I mean, Facebook tries to tell us what to think. Everybody tells us what to think constantly on the basis of whatever agenda they have. So but this is again why it's so important to be able to think independently. This is what Shannon's message is. I mean, don't just trust the. Actually, you know, the guy who I met in the pub who read Putin's essay. I was interested in talking to him because he actually read it, so he was trying to inform himself. But now I have this paper, so I meet another guy in the pub, and he says he's read Putin's paper, it's slightly sympathetic. I will flash this paper and say, now read that and be informed, be informed. So yeah, I think a problem is people can be easily influenced, too easily, if they don't have the independent way of thinking that we train ourselves to have. We think we have it.
So you were using the degree distribution as a measure of similarity, but the degree distribution is not a graph. It's to some extent a macroscopic description of the graph. Is there a better measure of similarity between graphs?
Well, we took a load of different measures, all the things in that big table I showed earlier, and we tried to. I just showed that particular because it's visual, so it gives us more striking. Yeah. So there's all sorts of things that we can do. We can model us kind of test some of these things and so on.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other comments that I have is about, you said it's democracy if you are surrounded by a lot of people. That really is not true. I mean, this is a small subset of people.
Well, yes, that's true.
Yes, and the question is, how do you choose these people? So do they actually represent, did they give a good representation of the population, of what the population is thinking, or are they all like you?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was a thing that when that petition was made in Athlone, my hometown, and the people who did not vote, when we met the council and they said, well, you have the silent majority, we didn't vote, that means they're for us. And that's an example of inaction being action, where, yeah.
Ralph,
Oh, I'm sorry, I can press something. I've got to do my trick here.
No, I think you need to do nothing. So you can ask a question, please.
Hello? Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Ralph, for a really fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. My question is this. You mentioned identity and statues, etc. Why do you think powers that be are so willing to remove statues just because a few BLM supporters want them removed?
Gosh, that's well, I suppose that's my personal opinion. I guess they want to be voted in.
Yeah, but it seems to be that what collectively the West has sort of lost its identity. If it's willing to erase the statues from the past, not just in the UK, but in the US. It's a bit like what the Taliban did in Afghanistan when they demolished the statues of the Buddha.
Well, I suppose was the Buddha offensive to somebody? I mean, some of these statues can be quite offensive to somebody. So I find the statue that's been erected in my hometown quite offensive. So I'd love it removed. I wouldn't go there and remove it because I haven't done so yet. But I don't know. I mean, of course, this is more an ethical question, isn't it, for everybody? We have no more expertise than anybody else on such a question as that. My own personal opinion is that I'm in support of removing these very offensive statues. That's a personal opinion, not based on anything I've done here in academia.
Okay.
Any other questions? Any other questions? No.
No.
No. So I think
Okay,
we just thank
Thank you, Ralph.
for the
thank you,
talk.
everybody.